Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Sunday Wire. I'm your host, Patrick Henningsen. We're streaming out live on the Alternate Current Radio Network and also at 21stCenturyWire.com. This is episode 234, of this weekly Omnibus News and Analysis radio program. Today is May 20th, 2018. And I'm very pleased, Mike, and also pleased for our guests. I'm going to introduce our next guest. The accomplished author and great geopolitical analyst, F. William Engdahl, is joining us on the live link from the heart of Europe. Hello, William.
Hello, Patrick. Good to be with you both.
Great to be with you as well, William. And there's a lot to talk about, but the main thing I want to talk about really is your new book, which we were plugging earlier, which is called Manifest Destiny: Democracy as Cognitive Dissonance. A very, very provocative title for your new book. There's a link on the show page people can go and click through. And this is material, William, that I'm very familiar with, obviously, not just from following your work, but these are things that people in our end of the media universe are very interested in, which is these soft power, or should I say smart power subterfuge, which is being meted out mainly by the United States. I'll hand it over to you, William. But I think this is a really important book coming out right now, and I think it'll be the first of many books. There's a lot of people, William, right now that are really looking into this after the string of color revolutions, after the Arab Spring. The timing right now of this sort of subject matter is really important because I think. In a way, William, I think that a lot of countries now are wise to this technique. Certainly Hungary comes to mind, Egypt comes to mind, all these countries, Russia, they have kicked out a lot of these U.S. NGOs. But go ahead and just give us a little introduction of this new book, William.
The idea behind the book is to show the context of these color revolutions. They're not just something that you throw a few dollars around in a place like Ukraine or in Russia in 1989-90 or something like that, and then you have a few agents that make a revolution. The idea is this is a diabolically effective scheme that was created by the CIA director of Ronald Reagan back in 1983, Bill Casey. And the idea was to do, as one of its founders said, the National Endowment for Democracy, which is the cornerstone of this whole fake democracy project, I call it. The idea behind it is to do what the CIA used to do in places like Iran in 1953 against Mossadegh, or in Guatemala and other places, Pinochet in Chile. But do it privately. So you have plausible deniability. Oh, the National Endowment for Democracy gave money to these human rights groups to educate people in principles of democratic order and election, poll watching, and so forth. But they're just a private group. They just mean well. And in fact, what has been refined, and it's been refined with Twitter and Facebook, which, by the way, is, I'm sure you know, Patrick, were spin-offs of certain CIA, NSA intelligence projects. But the use of social media, the use of smartphones or GPS-guided protests in places like Tahrir Square in Egypt have been devastatingly effective in bringing down governments and then bringing in more or less pawn governments that do what Washington tells them to, like Saakashvili in the Republic of Georgia back in 2003, or Yanushchenko in Ukraine 2004. So this is to show not just the examples, but the idea there's a continuum going from the early 80s to create a global, I don't know a better word for it, a global ordering that is based on complete vassal states of all these countries that stand in the way of Washington's agenda for a globalized world order.
And in particular, I want to talk about the Ukraine, William, because this seemed to me like the piece de la resistance of this move, of this project, or these series of projects, these series of color revolutions. I mean, the Arab Spring was quite a spectacle, but the Ukraine, what happened in February 2014, the overthrow of the Yanukovych government, the things that led up to that, I think is a real centerpiece of this strategy by the United States. And so, but go ahead.
Well, in the case of Ukraine, at the moment that Yanukovych, the elected president of Ukraine, made a decision not to go with the European Union associate membership, is a very bastardized kind of affiliation with the EU, but instead to go with an offer that Russia's Putin had made to join the Eurasian Economic Union, which of course makes more sense for Ukraine historically and economically. It's Kiev Rus is part of the soul of Russia historically, and the economies were so intermixed from the Soviet era. So what happened is you had protests, exactly what I described a few minutes ago. You had organized protests on the central square in Kiev, and people were being bussed in, paid money, students were being paid money to do it. You had Victoria Nuland, the Assistant Secretary of State, wife of Kagan, one of the top neocon ideologues, and she herself is a neocon, former ambassador to NATO, et cetera, et cetera. And she and the U.S. ambassador, Jeff Pyatt, in Kiev, micromanaged the thing together with these fake demonstrations. And then, as it came out later, the founder, George Friedman, the founder of Stratfor, gave an interview to a Russian newspaper some months later where he said this was the most blatant coup d'etat in U.S. history. And Nuland even admitted at one point, I think the figure was something like $5 billion of U.S. taxpayer money went into bringing a gaggle of neo-Nazis. This is no exaggeration. These are neo-Nazis. They have swastikas tattooed on their forearms. They have symbols and so forth that are just a variation of the SS insignia, and they follow the teachings of Stefan Bandera, who was a Nazi during the Ukrainian World War II period. So this was the gaggle that the U.S. brought in through this color revolution in Ukraine, and the coup was finalized by hired mercenary sharpshooters brought in from Georgia. And this only leaked out recently because 2 or 3 of the sharpshooters went public on this because they weren't paid the thousands of dollars that they were promised for killing police and demonstrators simultaneously to create total panic. And that's what led to the fleeing of the president and the coup d'etat. It was a U.S. hand-picked government. They haven't done anything to bring peace or stability in Ukraine. The idea was simply to break the link between the European Union and Russia going through Ukraine with the natural gas pipelines and other connections.
And I'll also point out, William, you probably already know this, but George Soros was very active in the Ukraine, even before, you could say, even before it, before the Soviet Union fell. Even the Renaissance Foundation, and they funded Ramanka TV and all these opposition media outlets, the U.S. Embassy, the Dutch Embassy, I believe the Dutch Embassy as well, possibly, if my memory serves me correctly. They're all throwing money into all of these opposition media outlets, and then in the National Endowment for Democracy and the other organizations you mentioned. And this helped to create the groundswell of the revolution, as it were. So these things were not organic.
Precisely.
Go ahead.
Nothing was organic, and the fake media, what they did was bring people. Soros began in 1989 when it was still part of the Soviet Union, so that was a pretty pretty bold move on his part with the Renaissance Foundation, as you mentioned, the Ukrainian branch of the Open Society Foundations. And then, and the National Endowment for Democracy as well. And they created this constant drum roll, and they brought something called OTPOR, the Gene Sharp, who wrote a handbook called Nonviolence as a Method of Warfare, this kind of loosely based on the Gandhi idea, but creating an inspiration for all these protesters. And Gene Sharp is totally tied into the Pentagon and his board of directors and his collaborators, Robert Helvey and others. So they deployed all of this constantly just to maximize the chaos. They did the same thing in Russia, as I describe in great detail in the book, The Rape of Russia, in 1990, that they brought in their NGOs to simply create chaos and bring Boris Yeltsin in to simply steal all the crown jewels of the Soviet Russian Federation.
Yeah, the Harvard boys. Yeah, that's. I saw this chapter as well. What I love about this book, William, is you have a glossary at the end, which is a glossary of Washington regime change NGOs, and is definitely a who's who, a veritable rogues gallery of organizations: the National Endowment for Democracy, the International Republican Institute, which is John McCain's little tool there, and the National Democratic Institute, the Center for International Private Enterprise, and the list goes on. Freedom House, of course, Open Society Foundations, USAID, the usual suspects, and the White Helmets are in there as well. International Crisis Group, they're interesting, William. Who and what are the International Crisis Group, and what is their function in this?
Well, this is again money from Soros. It's these are what the ICG does is kind of give the stamp of approval to say this government is corrupt and has to go, Venezuela, Maduro, or whoever it be, and then they issue one of these academic-sounding reports, and at that point the NGOs go into full activation to bring down the target government. So this is targeted coup d'etats is what you can call it, I think. Not regime change, but simply coup d'etats targeted under the name of democracy. All of this, it's to give credit where it's due for this nefarious thing, it's diabolically effective. Until, as you point out, now one after another, governments are slowly, but it's much too slow in my view. Orban is one of the more sophisticated political leaders, and I think he's doing some very positive things in Hungary. Therefore, he's branded a racist, a fascist, and so forth by the mainstream media, because he is doing something real against Soros and the European University and so forth. And he's got tremendous popularity in the Hungarian people. This is something that isn't reported very often, but he doesn't make major steps without holding a referendum first and making sure he has the people behind him. But most countries, China has wisened up in the 10 years that I've been going back and forth to China and meeting with people and giving talks. Now they're very savvy, maybe partly through my books where I talk about, in a number of them, the role of the National Endowment for Democracy. They started during the Hong Kong umbrella revolution several years ago. They named for the first time, why is the U.S. always making color revolutions? And they named the vice president of the NED, who was in Hong Kong at the time of the umbrella revolution. And shortly after that, that thing shut down. Interesting. So this is an example of the growing sophistication, but as I say, it's far from enough. But it's getting, countries are wisening up.
And so, that would be for a lot of Americans, William, that would be a controversial statement to say that there is mythology with the Tiananmen Square event, because that's held as kind of a sacrosanct democracy, pro-democracy protest, an iconic scene of the person being stood down by the tank and so forth, the Chinese military putting down this democratic revolution in China. You would talk about this a bit in your book, William, and that's a controversial approach for a lot of Americans, because people have they've never questioned this narrative and how this would broadcast in the media. Go ahead.
Yeah, I began to investigate an alternative. Tiananmen Square student massacre never took place. Deng Xiaoping, who was then the supreme leader, as they call it in China, ordered his People's Liberation Army units not to shoot students. He knew that would be catastrophic. The person who micromanaged the color revolution attempt of the students was the former CIA buddy of Father Bush, James E. Lilly, who was ambassador to Beijing and gave sanctuary to the student protesters, smuggled them out through an underground railroad that the U.S. Embassy ran and so forth, and landed them cushy university appointments in Harvard, Princeton, good jobs and so forth. But the massacre of the student, first of all, the student protest was really a bizarre collection of completely unradical demands. They demanded that the government of China take them seriously. I mean, that's hardly something to go on hunger strike and give your life for. But that came out of the handbook of Gene Sharp, his Albert Einstein Institution handbook. And they played for the propaganda. But even though the massacre never took place, Lilly instructed the Western media through various channels to write as if it did, and several of the handpicked organizers, student organizers, gave interviews to the Western media. I saw 20 students just shot down in cold blood by the People's Army, PLA. I saw X, Y, or Z, and so forth. And it later turned out in investigation that those particular students weren't even in Tiananmen Square when supposedly this happened. They gave dates and so forth. So this was all fake news. This was, and the reason for it was part of a coordinated move by the CIA, by the Pentagon, the State Department, all under President Bush Sr., to simultaneously bring down Soviet Union, which they pretty much succeeded for a while until a decade later, to bring down Yugoslavia, which was kind of a socialist middle way under Tito, and to bring down China, all three of those major places simultaneously. And then you can understand this Tiananmen Square. And it didn't happen. And I document this in the book for people who are skeptical, and I was certainly skeptical when a Chinese student told me that 10 years ago. Just matter-of-factly, it never happened. And then the more I researched, the more I investigated, I found documentation. Columbia Journalism Review, which is hardly a radical publication, I would say, a former Washington Post feature writer was in Tiananmen Square on the day that the massacre should have happened. He said it never happened. There were protests of workers from the countryside outside of Beijing that were threatening to get ugly, and a couple people got in bottle-throwing things with the police and the PLA, and there were some people killed there. But this massacre of students in Tiananmen Square never happened. They were allowed. They made a deal with the government to secretly leave under cover of darkness.
All organized through the U.S. Embassy in Beijing, right?
Yeah. James E. Lilly. Look him up. He's Skull and Bones, Yale University.
Good blue blood.
Bosom buddy of Gerbert Walker Bush. The whole thing. 30 years CIA.
Yeah, good blue blood. Good pedigree there. Very good pedigree. So really, what the bottom line with this strategy, William, is this whole concept of democracy. We hear this constantly. So this is what I'm getting from your book, is that this idea of democracy, or America bringing democracy or bringing change, doesn't have to be democracy anymore. It can just be change. But to bring this, it's not about the democracy. It's not about implementing reforms as such, because in so few cases, real reforms have ever been implemented in many of these countries, including Egypt, by the way. Not any real sweeping reforms. Is it not, William, about just changing the leadership of the country? It's not about democracy.
It's about correct. In my view, I can't think of one instance where there's been genuine participatory democracy encouraged by the United States as a result. The point is, we as a country have no business forcing democracy down the throat, no matter what name we give to it, or forcing regime change down the throat. If a country is waging war, we have rules under the United Nations Charter to deal with that in a peaceful way, or in peacekeeping forces, what will you? But not that we have the moral authority. Certainly, we don't have that anymore, to force other countries to follow an American template. The remains of democracy in the United States today are looking pretty battered and tattered, in my view. And there are also these NGOs active inside the United States, massively so, the Soros Foundation and others.
And this reminds me of a quote, by the way, and I do recommend people to go back and read some of Zbigniew Brzezinski's writings, especially his later books, William, in the recent years. But so he has a great quote here. This is from The Choice, Global Domination or Global Leadership. This is by Zbigniew Brzezinski, 2004. And I'm just going to read this. He's got a lot of these brilliant one-liners in here, and he says. He says, so, but it's important not to lose sight of the basic lesson of history. Any just cause in the hands of fanatics will degenerate into its antithesis. And so he's saying this is, you can look at the Spanish Inquisition, from Christianity to the Spanish Inquisition, or from the French Revolution to the guillotine, and from Leninism to Stalinism. And he's talking about he's warning this is the danger of the United States' fanatical zeal of democracy promotion. He said that it can turn into the antithesis of democracy. That's Zbigniew Brzezinski in 2004. And he does warn about this in this book, William. Go ahead. Yeah.
No, I was just going to give an example. The Hillary Clinton State Department, back in the time of the Egyptian color revolution in Tahrir Square, the Arab Spring, so-called, it was hardly a spring. There you had hundreds of thousands of students who really genuinely believed that they were on the streets to get rid of a military dictatorship under Mubarak and so forth. And the thing grew to a certain dimension that Mubarak stepped down, and then the U.S. moved in to work with the various opposition groups that it had encouraged, and then suddenly you had elections being called in a space of several months, and the only organized force that was capable of waging a national campaign was the Muslim Brotherhood. Hillary Clinton and the whole agenda of the Greater Middle East project back then of the U.S. was to bring the Muslim Brotherhood in these Arab countries into power, and through that the CIA channels, the Saudi channels and so forth, hopefully they thought, would be able to make them into puppet regimes of Washington. And that didn't happen for various reasons. Mohammed Morsi was forced out in let's call it what it was. It was a military putsch by al-Sisi. But the idea was never to install democracy. It was to use the banner of democracy to deceive people into making these mass protests and then bringing in who they wanted. And that's it's pretty ugly stuff.
Yeah, no. Egypt is a whole story within a story. A lot of people aren't aware. Yeah. There were two Arab Springs in Egypt. There was the original protest to oust Mubarak in January 2011, and there was the second one, which I believe was in June of 2013, and that ousted the Muslim Brotherhood, the Morsi government as well, and Saudi Arabia and the UAE were hugely behind that, pumping money into. They were shipping the banners in English, had all the printing done, and it was more people came out for the second uprising than the first. But what happened in the end, William? They didn't get the democracy they wanted. They only got change. Yeah. They only got change.
They got change. Yeah. And I don't think, Patrick, that Washington was so clearly guiding that. But once a military dictatorship under al-Sisi came into power, they said, "Okay, let's work to keep them on the plantation." But they didn't get democracy anywhere near it. I had dinner last night with an Egyptian businessman that I've known for years. And he simply described it quite honestly. He says it's a dictatorship, military dictatorship. And I have to do business with them, and it's not so easy.
Yeah, and their economy is still got all the same fundamental structural problems that it had before 2011. That's not really changed at all. They're falling foul of major economic trends in the region. They're borrowing more. They're having to borrow money. They can't collect taxes. It's got one of the lowest tax collection rates of any modernized country. They can't. No one wants to pay tax, so the receipts are not much. But so the bottom line, to kick off a color revolution, William, what I'm getting from your book is that you need a couple of things to happen, and it's not about the will of the people or the aspirations of the reformists, revolutionaries, and so forth. You need money. You need lots of money from the outside. That's one thing I picked up. The other thing is you need media support, or you need some kind of a media operation, and social media is an important part of that, which you said. And then you need crowd manipulation. So John McCain and other U.S. I believe it was Congressman Murphy, I can't remember, they showed up with the right sector on and Svoboda. They're there on stage in the Ukraine, basically giving. American elected representatives are in the Ukraine giving speeches essentially to overthrow the government.
So, Joe Biden played it. Joe Biden played a key role in that too, as well, Patrick.
Yeah, he was the middleman, wasn't he? He stabbed Yanukovych in the back. He kept saying everything's going to be all right. Everything's going to be. So he's on the phone with Yanukovych every other day, right? And then he's just plunged the knife into his back at the very. But and you need provocateurs as well. You need the shock troops to come in at the end to really stir up the police and to create those violent clashes that make for the viral media images. So William, it's kind of a formula, really. It's a complicated formula, and it's not just one thing or two things. You need 4, 5, 6, 7 different things to work. And is this why, William, that this was successful in some countries like the Ukraine, but it wasn't successful in Syria, for instance?
The Syria problematic is I would say yes, no. You know much more about Syria on the ground than I do, certainly. But at a certain point, Syrian intelligence is weak as the country was, realized, I think, what they were up against. But then all hell was thrown at them in terms of ISIS, Al-Qaeda. The model was more based on Hillary Clinton's Gaddafi Libya model. It was more a military solution because Syria was a much tougher nut to crack, as Washington saw it. So, and then, of course, the intervention of Russia militarily on request at September 2015, that changed the whole dynamic.
There's a lot of talk right now, William. The next big one. What is the next big regime change push? What is the next big color revolution? A lot of people are talking about Iran. Yeah, go ahead. Tell us about
no question about it. angered some of my regular readers when I wrote a piece some weeks ago in NEO, where I write regularly, that the currency crisis with the Iranian rial, the currency collapse, was being encouraged as a softening up for a color revolution regime change attempt. And the sanctions, the breaking of the Iran nuclear agreement, the sanctions are designed to create, in economic terms, the crisis that is going to then see activation of inside groups that were taken off the U.S. terrorism list, like MEK, who are simply terrorists. But so I think Iran is the next prime target.
I think we had an Israeli official just a couple of days ago advocating for exactly that, William, saying that Israel will work on the sort of covert end to create the conditions. This is an ex-Mossad official. And Saudi Arabia and the U.S. can help in this process. This was in the Jerusalem Post, to achieve regime change and a color revolution in Iran. He said, we can deal with the threat itself. However, there's a major opening here. This is a situation that they can exploit, and he's basically going through step by step. So it's kind of kind of bizarre, William. This is out in the open.
They're trying to spook the Iranian government, I think, to make mistakes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So this is
my guess.
It is a big danger. It's a big country. Iran is physically, geographically is a big country. There's a number of major cities, different regions. There are different ethnic and sectarian communities in that country as well that make up the rich tapestry that is Iran. There's a very rich political discourse in Iran. It's very sophisticated politically. There's a lot of democracy going on in Iran. It might not be the democracy the West wants in terms of an open system that you can come in and manipulate at will, but there's a tradition of discourse there, very healthy, William, in Iran. But that could be turned against the government as well with some effort, with some engineering. But what do you think the prospects are for an outside movement like that to push for a regime change in Iran? How easy or difficult do you think that would be?
Very difficult. I think it's very difficult, but they're going to try with everything they've got. That's what I see now, because you've got John Bolton and Pompeo and these characters in there calling the shots on the Trump administration, and they're quite open. They say it won't come to a military encounter, I don't think, because that simply wouldn't have an effect. It would be catastrophe for the U.S. But to come to a chaos scenario, I think that's what they're going to opt for through new swift sanctions and weakening the currency and all sorts of things. The difference is that today Russia and China are much more engaged in Iran than they were in 2007, 2009, in that period when Ahmadinejad was being challenged by a color revolution. So it's difficult to say. They're clearly doing some serious preparations for a major destabilization, regime change. But I think chaos is what they want, economic chaos.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it is, William, it is a very different playing field today in 2018 than it was 10 years ago in 2008 or 20 years ago in 1998. The United States, would you agree that the U.S.'s position is very much it's degraded from its former position in terms of influence, and other players have become stronger? Certainly, I'm looking at the Astana process, the Sochi process, where you have Iran, Turkey, Russia seeming to work together towards some sort of a resolution for the Syrian crisis. And Syria itself might come out of this a lot stronger in terms of its relationships and its allied relationships. This is a very different Middle East, William. This is a very different Eurasia than was 10, 20.
Yeah, I would agree very much, Patrick, and I would say it's a very different world, because what you have with the unilateral breaking of the nuclear treaty with Iran by Trump administration, you have a situation where the European Union is more distant from Washington than I've ever seen it in the post-1945 period.
Mm-hmm.
So Europe is a vassal entity of NATO, so it's not so easy to just say, okay, we're going to do this and this and this. But it's really, I think the crucial showdown will be if U.S. pressure on the SWIFT interbank payment system in Belgium is going to succeed in breaking SWIFT links for Iranian banks like it did 2012 or not. If the Europeans refuse to budge on that issue, then it can become quite interesting. So it's a very different situation.
Yeah, I noticed.
The U.S. is playing the high-risk poker here.
You're absolutely right. I've never seen the United States and the EU not close together as they were before. Right now, they're really far apart. There's a crack opening, William. And I believe we spoke about this before you came on. Russia has also seen this opportunity with Germany, and certainly there looks like some signs of very healthy relations between Germany and Russia. Would you agree with that?
The German industry would love in a second to renew the economic relations with Russia. They know exactly what's going on with these sanctions. The problem is Germany is an occupied country, and it's still occupied. And there's so many levers of control of Washington, the CIA, the NSA. The NSA monitored the cell phone of Anglo-American several years ago. So this is it's difficult. The pressure points, for example, the sanctions on Iran. The secondary sanctions are the real killer on this, because if the European Union has this blocking resolution, and let's say that the Siemens, a huge company that's involved in power projects and many big industrial things in Iran, let's say that they get encouraged by their government to continue doing business with Iran or Airbus, the huge European airplane maker. Billions of dollars involved here. And then Washington says, oh, you're doing business with Iran. U.S. policy means that you can't do business in the United States. And I can tell you, the German government is not about to indemnify Siemens or Airbus for billions of dollars. They couldn't handle it.
Right. So you're saying it's too much trouble to be caught up in the courts with the United States over their U.S. businesses. The U.S. can still attack companies that are trading in the U.S., right? International companies.
Well, that's the diabolical thing of these secondary sanctions, and this is a new element that is really, really nasty. It just violates international law, the principles of the World Trade Organization, as rotten as the WTO is. But the U.S. doesn't care anymore.
Yeah. So this is going to be interesting, William, for sure. The last thing I want to ask you, this is slightly off topic, but I really want to ask you because you did kind of allude a little bit to the emergence of Asia, of China, of the Belt and Road project. Is Germany not the one European country that could really capitalize on the One Belt, One Road initiative? I mean, Germany is so well positioned to really explode from this opportunity. And is this something the United States is trying to keep from happening, do you think?
Very much so. Germany is even being threatened to build a second parallel gas pipeline from Russia to northern Germany because the U.S. is against it. So the Silk Road, the Belt Road Initiative of Beijing, which is a brilliant project. It has potential to lift Europe and Eurasia out of economic misery in the next 20 to 30 years. High-speed rail links, deep-water ports, electricity connections, energy pipelines, and so forth. It's huge. German industry would love to get involved in that, as far as I can tell. But the government is against it. They say, well, it's not transparent, you know. But that's, I think, very much the U.S. pressure.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's we're gonna break there. But I want to just give a shout to your book once again. There's a link on the show page. The book is called Manifest Destiny: Democracy as Cognitive Dissonance. This lays out the whole NGO complex very succinctly. This is a book by F. William Engdahl, our guest today on the Sunday Wire. Fantastic book, William, and we do encourage people to go and buy this book because this is essential in your toolbox to educate yourself as to what exactly your governments are doing with public money and around the world. So our hats off to you, William, for this fantastic latest book.
Thank you very much, Patrick.
And we hope to speak to you again soon. And there's a link to your website as well. At William Engdahl's blog, there's a link to that on the show page as well. So go check out William. He's got a number of other titles you might want to go look at too, which I would also encourage to consider purchasing for your book, an education collection, as I like to call it. But anyway, take care, William, and all the best.
Thank you, Patrick. Yeah.
We hope to speak to you soon.
Yeah. Okay, and if people go on my website and they'll get a notice to subscribe to my free regular geopolitical newsletter, which has excerpts from my writings over the past 10, 12 years, and also from some of the books. So that's available as well.
Yeah, you can go check that out. Yep. It'll pop up. It'll pop up on the screen as soon as you go to William's blog. You'll get an alert to sign up for his free newsletter. So please do go.
WilliamEngdahl.com. Yeah.
Yep, exactly. There it is on the link right now on the show page. Go check it out, ladies and gentlemen. But all the best, William. Take care.
Thank you, Patrick. Yeah, you too.